So now we're going to talk about clinical application. We've kind of talked about the research piece already, but thinking about how this actually matters when you get into the real world, when you work as SLPs and audiologists and see these kids. So I'm going to start with kind of a general overview of evidence-based practice. This is a model that's pretty well accepted, and we know that definitely the empirical evidence or the research base matters, and we want to pay attention to that. And so we think of that when we're considering what to do with individuals with any disorder, really, that we're working with. But there's also these other two parts. So we have the wisdom and values of the family and then of the professionals. And so we want to consider what the family knows about their child, what goals they're working towards, what preferences they might have over intervention, and what fits with the family. And then we also want to think about the professionals who are going to be implementing these interventions. So whether that's SLPs or teachers or the parents that are doing something in the home, daycare providers, we want to know kind of what their skill set is and take that into consideration when we're making decisions. So the idea is that we put all these together and we're able to come to a conclusion that, that works, that takes these things into account, and we are able to do some type of evidence-based practice. So that is how we should make decisions and how we like to make decisions, but nothing's ever as clean as that in the real world, and so we know that there are things that come into play that create barriers for really implementing these evidence-based practices. Some of the things is the evidence base might not be there, and so right now I've moved in to work with high schoolers. There's not a lot of research on high schoolers with autism, and so we have to pull from different age groups or different populations and see if we can make that work. Some of it is how quickly that evidence might be released or how the public finds out about it. So is it translated in a way that makes it easy for clinicians and parents to understand and use? Does it take years to get that research out? And then the last part is kind of this access to evidence-based services. And so do kids actually have access to the services that they need? Do they have the number of hours of IEP services that they need? Are there practitioners in their area that have the skill set that would allow people to implement that intervention? And so things start to break down. And so I thought I'd kind of walk through maybe a somewhat typical example if we think about autism intervention. So the Early Start Denver model is a model that has been proven to work with young kids that are at risk for autism or maybe have an early diagnosis. And it's something that the kids have better outcomes later on. So we know this is a really great model. It's pretty intensive, and there's been some work around implementing it in the home with a little bit less intensity. But let's say the family hears about this and they're like, yes, we want to do Early Start Denver model. We know that we want to do this. But they're in a state where the kid gets 1 hour of service a month, and maybe none of the professionals that are going to be working on that child's team know how to implement Early Start Denver. And the agency they work for is not going to pay for them to go to the training to learn to implement it. So you have to figure out, okay, what are the parts of that practice that we can pull in? What other evidence-based practices are there that might fit in this situation? And so the result is that a lot of evidence-based practices don't get used in the real world, or at least not the way they're intended, and it breaks down in kind of the outcomes you see from the kids sometimes then. Let's see. Oops. So I thought I would talk kind of broadly about the evidence base in autism, and I try to think of things in chunks. It's easier for me because there's a lot going on in any one study to try to draw from that. So the first thing I start with is content and thinking about what we want to address, what skills we want to address. So if you've done any coursework on goal setting, that would be kind of where this comes into play. What skills do we want to hit on that we know will make a difference long run? And ASHA actually put out a really good kind of collection of resources, and they have some suggestions for skills to address, like functional and spontaneous communication, nonverbal communication, problem behaviors. That's something that is inevitable with kids in general maybe, but definitely with kids with autism. And so they have this list of things that as an SLP you might need to address and are important to address for the students with autism. And then the National Research Council is a little more general. It has kind of broader categories for anyone who's working with a child, not just specific to the SLP. And so both of these resources kind of have a lot of great skills that you can, or areas of skills. The other thing that there's been a lot of research on are what's called pivotal skills. And you might have heard this term in other courses before, but a pivotal skill is like, you can think of it as a skill that once you get that, it allows you to do a lot more other skills. It kind of acts as a pivot point. It's an important skill to have. So a pivot skill is imitation. If a child can learn to imitate, they can learn to say vocabulary. They imitate their parents saying vocabulary words. They imitate play behaviors that they see a sibling or a friend doing. Another example is shared engagement. So if you're able to share engagement with a person or a person and an object, better yet, you're able to pick up on all those same skills. If I'm playing with cars with a little kid and I crash the car and I say, crash, but they're not paying attention to what I'm doing, they're not going to know what that crash is referring to. They don't pick up on that. So that shared engagement acts as a pivot skill to get all those other skills. So that's another thing we know about content areas. So then once we decide kind of what we want to address, we need to think about how we want to address it. And so there's different strategies. And there are a lot of great resources on what strategies are evidence-based for kids with autism. So these two, the National Professional Development Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders and the National Autism Center, are two centers that were put together, and they reviewed thousands of journal articles and picked the ones where they had a very rigorous studies. So studies you knew were accurate. The data was there. You could tell that they were set up in a way that made sense. And they kind of compiled those and talked about what skills they address, how they address those skills, and identified strategies that we know work with kids with autism. So both of those, the NPDC just came out with a brand new report a couple months ago, and the NAC actually has a report due out later this summer. So it's free to you. You can go access it once you're practicing, and you can see a list of the things that work with kids with autism. And so there's actually quite a bit of evidence on these unique, or these strategies that cut across many of the interventions. We don't have as much information about some of the very specific interventions, so that's still kind of a growing area. Next, we want to think about the population. So where does the evidence, or who does the evidence apply to? Who does the research apply to? We have a lot for young kids. We have quite a bit for elementary school students. When you get into middle school and high school and adulthood, the evidence for working with individuals with autism really drops off. And so that's definitely an area that they're trying to target now, the teens and adults, thinking about starting to get them into places of their workplaces and how they're doing there. So you want to kind of look at the evidence base and see where things fit for the population that you're working with. And then the last thing to consider is thinking about the setting. And so you want to, before, as I said, research was done in these very kind of isolated clinic settings, and it wasn't very naturalistic. And so knowing if that study would work in the real world was hard. So there's been a big push for naturalistic settings, and that happens a lot more in research now. So there's a pretty good evidence base for things that are happening in homes and schools with kids with autism that are in the setting where they actually live from day to day. The other thing that you had brought up in the first talk was the one-to-one versus group settings, and we know that both of those are important for kids with autism. So we know that one-to-one attention, that's great for learning new skills. It really gives them a lot of opportunities to practice the skill, and gives an opportunity for them to get specific feedback on that skill. Group settings are where we try to take those new skills that were learned and generalize it and maintain it, and hopefully it will continue for the rest of their life. So life happens in a group setting. So we do want to make sure that we're doing that for kids with autism, that we're putting them in group settings. Okay, so I thought I would walk you through a case example. This is a little 4-year-old with autism. He's in a preschool classroom. This is a little ways into the school year. At the beginning of the year, he was brand new to the class. He was a 3-year-old at the beginning of the year, And he was in a classroom where they use structured teaching, which is also sometimes called teach. They use like visual schedules, and the kids work a lot on their independence, at transitioning from activity to activity independently. So it was a very structured setting. They had different centers where the kids could play, but he wasn't engaging much at all. We did an assessment with him at the beginning of the year, this really fun assessment called the ADOS that has a lot of toys. It's pretty engaging for the kids. And he's a 3-year-old. He was sitting on the floor, and he really didn't move very much, which is amazing for a 3-year-old, right? Most 3-year-olds would be running all over the place. There were bubbles, there were trucks, there were baby dolls, there were remote control animals, and he kind of just sat there, and he didn't look up at the examiners too much. He didn't initiate communication. He like rolled the truck a couple times, but that's really all he did. So in the classroom, they were having him a hard time getting him to engage. And he definitely wasn't initiating with really the staff or the peers for communication at all. And his mom and teacher very much wanted him to be able to play at school with his siblings, to pay attention to the others in his environment and engage with them. So when we're thinking about choosing an intervention, the first thing at the bottom was the population and setting. That's not really changing. We kind of know who this guy is, and we know the classroom he's in that we're going into work in. So I kind of consider those first. The classroom has 7 other children that have autism or other developmental disorders. So there's a lot of kids with pretty high needs, but there's a teacher and 2 TAs, and they're really good at doing kind of the foundational intervention things. So the prompting, the reinforcement, visual supports, they're pretty good with all that. They weren't as strong with creating opportunities for that kind of social interaction piece. And then when we think about the population, we know kind of his needs are going to be at that emerging communication level. He's not really doing much, so we're starting kind of at just trying to get him to interact. And so when I think about the content for that, then I was talking about shared engagement, a really important skill. The first step to shared engagement is just face-to-face interactions, building that motivation to communicate with people. So things that really young kids do are peekaboo or so big. If you guys have babysat or had siblings, they do these kind of games, and kids learn to engage, and they laugh, and they know when to laugh. And so that's kind of where we started with these very basic social interactions. And I knew the teacher was good at the prompting and fading and the reinforcement, but not as good with arranging opportunities. So what's good to think about if you're coming into the classroom to work with a kid in the natural setting, think about things that you can model for the other people that are going to be in that setting more consistently. So I wanted to kind of arrange opportunities to promote that social interaction. And this is in their gross motor area, which has like a bean bag and a little trampoline. And you're going to see me working with this guy and not doing super well at the beginning, but attempting to find something that interests him, and then kind of watch how I gradually pull back and give opportunities for him to initiate the interaction we set up. 1, 2, 3.
Look, I can use a screwdriver like this, Alex. Can you do that with your finger? Oh, what a great, let's do some more on our house.
Not interested. Watch this. Can we do spaghetti shake?
The wrench was in the
1, 2, 3. Spaghetti shake! 1, 2, 3. Spaghetti shake! 2.
running. Do we need to build a house?
Shake!
Let's build a house for the next. Look, here's the door. Oh, look. Here's
1,
the door.
2,
Can you find some windows?
3.
Window.
So one of the things with kids with autism is you want to set up routines, like kind of things that you're doing with them and then violate those or kind of change it up on them so that they have to initiate. So I had cut out little clips from that, but it was kind of gradual. At first, I was doing it all, and then I would kind of say 1 and wait for him to say 2, and then one of the clips you saw, he said 1, and so I said 2, and then he said 3, and then I kind of dropped my arms to see if he would actually initiate. And so you can see we're building that routine, and hopefully if you're in the classroom more and more, they get used to some of those routines. You can change it up and do something less physical and more kind of, this is not something you would necessarily see people doing with a preschooler all the time, but it's a way to get in there and kind of motivate him to communicate. I'm now an interesting partner to him because I've shaken his arms and he likes that. So, but it's not always easy finding that kind of hook for the kid. So that's kind of a picture of what it can look like. I gave that example before with this really complex intervention about making a decision. But lots of times you're going into a classroom or a home and you're making these decisions that they are consequential, but they're smaller decisions than what's the educational programming going to be overall. That's already sometimes in place, and you might be able to advocate for something else, but you can't necessarily change that all right away. So you're picking out, what are we going to work on today, and what's the first step we're going to take to get him where he needs to go eventually. So, all right. So I thought I would leave you with some resources. The wonderful thing about autism is because it's increasing in prevalence, there's a lot of money going into it, and there are a lot of resources that are free to the world right now. So all of these resources, you can go online. Some of them, they will ask you for your email, but you don't have to pay for them. And the autism internet modules, you can go on and do these modules on these skills like prompting, self-management, all these like kind of foundational skills that you can use to work with kids with autism. And the 2 at the bottom are the ones that I talked about that have the lists of strategies. And it also has them separated by what skill areas they work for. So you can look at social skills and communication and see what kind of strategies work for those specific skill areas across the ages. So that's it for the clinical application piece. It's not as big and scary as it seems, I don't think, but it is important to stay up on the research and to think about it critically. But there's also a lot of things that you can do that are taking this basic set of skills that are strategies that we know work and applying them in the setting where the kid is. So, questions?
So when you talked about the evidence-based practice triangle, one of the pieces that we've spoken about in classes and that you mentioned might not get as much love is the family values. But I'm wondering if, because the prevalence is increasing, are you finding that families are more savvy about autism spectrum disorders, or is that a good thing for us or a bad thing? Or
That's a really good
between?
question. That's, I think, a double-edged sword a little bit. I think it's great. There is a ton of resources out there. There's also some not so great resources, and there's people that get a lot of press time that aren't promoting things that work for every kid. I think another complicating factor is kids with autism look very different, so something that works really well for one kid might not work for everyone. I think it's great that parents are informed. Parents are the best advocates for the kids. They really are. And if anyone has their best interest, it is almost always going to be the parent. They have the most pure best interests oftentimes. I know that's not the case across the board, but so you do want to take that into account. But there's also things that are challenging about that. So I had a student who was verbal, but we were trying to use a communication system because he wasn't very verbal. His parents were interested in that. And there was this news piece that came on about a young adult in California who was doing like what they call facilitated communication. He was typing things out. And so his dad was like, I think if we could just get him to, let's try this, we could get him to type. But this kid wasn't a reader. And so he couldn't have typed because he wasn't reading and spelling and doing things like that. And so trying to balance, like, we are doing our best to help him communicate, and we want to make this work, but this might not be the best way for him because there's this skill set that he doesn't have. So it can be challenging, but I think it's important too because honestly, parents are looking at things and they might find things that we don't know about, that it's hard for us to stay up on the research, but they are doing it 24/7. So yeah, I think kind of a both and, if that makes sense. Yeah. Questions?
What do you see kind of across the lifespan as the next biggest steps or the things that you think that we're on the verge of knowing more about in intervention in the world of autism?
Yeah. I think there is a push right now to really look at adults with autism. I went to this amazing conference that was actually in Chapel Hill that was put on by parents and invited all these businesses across the country who are employing adults with autism. I would say probably 75% of them were started by parents of kids with autism who didn't have a special education background or a speech language background. They were business people or computer programmers or whatever, and they started these businesses. So I think there is a push going towards that, and I think that is going to be really important. Another hope that I have with where we're going is I hope that we will continue to figure out more about the profiles of kids with autism. And so looking at I think there are probably autisms, not autism. They present so differently. So I hope that we are moving more towards tailored interventions. But I think that is a longer way off because we don't have a great way of kind of characterizing all those different kind of categories of skill yet. But I hope we're moving there. So, yeah, good question.
You were mentioning families and family values. When we have families here in the clinic, a lot of times they talk about modifying the child's diet as a main, factor to change the behavior. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the research base certainly does not support like gluten, casein-free diets or some of those things. But I think it's hard to make a decision. So just because the research isn't there doesn't mean it doesn't work for anyone. Because of the same reason where I think we're dealing with autisms, we're dealing with multiple etiologies, multiple causes, and presentations. It's hard for me to disregard what parents are saying, especially if they're the ones that have to carry that out. Now, some kids, I think, don't look, maybe they don't look different on the diet, and it's really hard for them. It's creating more behavior problems. But yeah, so I guess what I would say is I don't think the evidence is there, but I also don't think we can say categorically it does not work across the board. And so I think just being really smart as a clinician about how you look at that. I mean, there are ways to track data and do things on and off diets. And I know people who are who don't have autism who have done diets that they seem to think work really well for them. And I guess if that, I don't think it's something we can advocate for them doing, but I don't think it's something we need to push them away from doing either. So, yeah.
You talked about there being an increase in funding for autism in general. Can you talk a little bit about whether that's more on the side of the research or the implementation? For example, if I were an SLP in a school and I wanted some extra funding to get a cool
Yeah. So because I think some of that might happen through foundations or private organizations. So I know a teacher at one of the schools we're working with in North Carolina who has gotten an iPad for every kid in her classroom. She's in high school. I think she has 8 kids in her classroom, and I think she started getting them for the room next door. And some of it was through purchasing them herself, but some of it was through the PTO, and some of it was through the Autism Society, the local chapter of the Autism Society. So you can apply for grants, sometimes through the school district, sometimes through private foundations. So I think research dollars are probably going up in autism relative to some other things. I don't actually know the stats on that right now, but I know research money in general is going down because of our the financial climate of the country. So it's hard to say where that's heading for sure. But I do think there's a lot of interest in autism, and there's public service announcements. People know about it. Everyone asks about it or talks about it when they find out that I'm interested in it. So I think there will be opportunities to get that. And the other thing now is I see so many teachers use crowdfunding sources. Have you guys seen this? So they it's like sponsor my project or something. And so if you have something small that you want to get a new computer software program, you can go online, put something up on Facebook, and have $400 within a few days from people across the nation who are interested in supporting an SLP who's working with a child with autism. So, yeah.
My mom's a parapro for special education, and at the school that she's at, there's a big push lately to move children out of self-contained setting and into the classroom with all the typically developing students with a parapro. What do you think is better for the students?
Yeah. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is very progressive in education. So I grew up, that was all I knew. When I was in middle school, I had kids with autism in my class. They weren't at the same elementary school as me because they kind of did group them together in one elementary school, but they're always included. And so I thought that was the only way. And I thought it was valuing the kids more and giving them more opportunities. And then I went and worked, I went to and worked at a school that was a private school that was just for kids with disabilities. And I asked during my interview, which looking back might have not been the best idea, do you really think it's a good idea to have kids in a school where they have no opportunities to interact with typically developing peers? And they said, well, that's never our end goal. They don't want to keep them at that school. They want to get them back out. But also, these kids made remarkable progress. And these were kids with some of the most challenging behaviors, the most significant needs in some cases. And so I think there are advantages to both. I think you want to have inclusive opportunities. You have to figure out a way to make that happen for kids because the world is an inclusive place. But I've also heard a story of a parent who believed very strongly in inclusion. And she pushed for her child to be included all the time. And then in middle school, he ended up going to a separate school for half the day and his public school for half the day. And he had his first friend at his school where it was just kids with special needs. And having a friend is really important. It's really valuable. And so there's things like that where it's like, maybe they're not missing opportunities. Maybe it looks different. So I think that's another kind of both and where I think inclusive is if we had unlimited funding and we could do that well, that would be the way to go. But you can't provide the same amount of structure and support sometimes in those inclusive settings. So I think that sometimes having a separate setting might be what's best for the kid for a period of time or in a given situation. So that's a good question. Any others? All right, well, thanks for listening.